He thought it was just another episode, but he was wrong. Steve Harvey had seen thousands of contestants stand at that podium, each carrying their own stories, their own dreams, their own reasons for being there. But he'd never seen a child clutch a piece of jewelry with such desperate intensity, as if letting go would mean losing something far more precious than any game show prize could ever replace. The boy was 12 years old, though he looked younger, small for his age in the way children sometimes are when hunger has been more familiar than abundance, when survival has required them to stay compact, unobtrusive, easy to overlook. His name was Raj, and he stood at the Family Feud podium during a special international episode, featuring families from around the world who'd overcome extraordinary circumstances. He wore clothes that were carefully pressed but slightly too large, hand-me-downs from somewhere, and his dark hair had been combed neatly back from his forehead, with the kind of attention that spoke of someone else's careful hands, someone who wanted him to look his best. But it was the necklace that caught the light. A simple thing. Really a thin silver chain with a small pendant that glinted under the studio lights every time the boy moved. From a distance, it looked like nothing special, the kind of inexpensive jewelry you might find at any market stall. But the way Raj's hand kept drifting to it, touching it, making sure it was still there, suggested it carried a weight that had nothing to do with silver or monetary value. Steve had been in the middle of his usual pre-question banter, that easy rapport he'd perfected over decades, designed to put contestants at ease and warm up the audience. He'd asked Raj about his journey to America, about what he thought of the studio, about whether he was nervous. The boy had answered politely but quietly, his accent marking him as someone still learning the rhythms of English, still finding his way in a language that wasn't quite home. Then Steve noticed the necklace. Really noticed it. The way Raj's fingers had closed around the pendant just as Steve asked him a simple question about his family. The way the boy's entire body had tensed, his jaw tightening, his eyes suddenly bright with something that looked like tears held back through sheer force of will. "That's a nice necklace you got there, young man," Steve had said, pointing to it with genuine curiosity. "Looks like it means something to you." The studio had gone quiet in that particular way that happens when people sense they're about to witness something real. The audience leaned forward slightly in their seats. The cameras zoomed in, capturing the moment Raj's hand tightened around the pendant, his knuckles going white with the pressure. And then the boy spoke 3 words that would change everything. "It's my mother's." Not, "it was my mother's." Not past tense. Present. As if she were still there, still claiming ownership, still connected to this small piece of silver and the child who wore it like a lifeline. Steve's expression shifted something in his face, recognizing the weight behind those words, the careful grammar that revealed more than any explanation could. The comedian, the entertainer, the professional host all receded, and what remained was just a man standing before a child who was holding on to something that transcended jewelry, transcended memory, transcended every boundary between what was lost and what remained. The question Steve was supposed to ask next died on his lips. The game show format, the points, the competition, none of it mattered anymore. Because standing at that podium was a 12-year-old boy from India, clutching his mother's necklace, and something in the way he said, "It's my mother's," told Steve Harvey that he was about to hear a story that would break his heart and remind him why some moments are bigger than television. To understand what happened in that studio, you have to go back 2 years, to a monsoon-soaked evening in Mumbai where a woman named Anjali Sharma worked 3 jobs to keep her son fed, clothed, and dreaming. She cleaned houses in the morning, sold flowers at a busy intersection in the afternoon, and sewed clothes for a tailor late into the night, her fingers moving by lamplight while Raj pretended to sleep on a thin mattress in the corner of their one-room apartment. Anjali had been alone since Raj was born. His father had disappeared before the child drew his first breath, leaving behind only absence and a woman determined that her son would have more than she'd been given. She couldn't afford school uniforms, so she sewed them herself from fabric scraps. She couldn't buy textbooks, so she borrowed them from neighbors and copied lessons by hand in the margins of newspapers. She couldn't give Raj 3 meals a day, but she made sure the 2 he got were prepared with love and the kind of hope that refuses to acknowledge impossible odds. The necklace had been her mother's, the only thing of value Anjali had inherited when her parents died in a bus accident when she was 16. It wasn't expensive, just simple silver with a small pendant engraved with a lotus flower. but it represented the only family legacy she possessed. She wore it every day, tucked beneath her sari, a secret talisman against the weight of poverty and solitude. One day, she used to tell Raj as she tucked him in at night, her fingers absently touching the necklace, "One day you'll have everything I couldn't give you. Education, opportunity, a life where you don't have to count every rupee. But no matter how big that life becomes, remember where you came from. Remember that love is worth more than money, and that the people who sacrifice for you are the real treasures." Raj would nod, not fully understanding but memorizing her words anyway, storing them like precious things in the vault of his young heart. The illness came suddenly, a fever that wouldn't break, a cough that rattled her chest like stones in a jar. Anjali kept working because stopping meant starving, kept pushing through exhaustion because her son needed her. By the time she finally collapsed, it was too late. Pneumonia, the doctors said. Untreated for too long. Her lungs were failing, her body shutting down system by system. In the hospital, a charity ward with peeling paint and insufficient beds, Anjali had called Raj to her side. He was 10 years old, small and terrified, watching his mother struggle to breathe through tubes and machines that beeped their mechanical concern. "Beta," she whispered, using the Hindi word for son that carried more affection than English could capture. "Listen carefully. I'm going to give you something very important." Her hands, weakened by illness but still capable of one final gesture of love, reached up and unclasped the necklace. She placed it in Raj's palm, closing his small fingers around it. "This was my mother's. Now it's yours. When you wear it, you carry 3 generations of love. Your grandmother, who I never got to know well enough. Me, who loves you more than breathing. And someday, when you have children, you'll pass it to them. Promise me you'll keep it safe. Promise me you'll remember." Raj had promised through tears, clutching the necklace like it could anchor his mother to this world, like the weight of silver could be enough to hold back death. She died 3 hours later, with her son's hand in hers, and her mother's necklace already around his neck, warm from her body heat, carrying the last traces of her touch. The months that followed were a blur of orphanages and foster homes, and the grinding machinery of a system overwhelmed by too many children with too few resources. Raj moved through it all in silence, speaking only when necessary, touching the necklace compulsively, reminding himself that he'd once been loved completely by someone who'd sacrificed everything. Then came Sarah and David Mitchell, an American couple in their 40s who'd spent years trying to have children before finally accepting that their family would be built through adoption rather than biology. They'd come to India specifically looking for older children, the ones who usually got overlooked, who'd learned not to hope too loudly because disappointment hurt less when you expected it. They'd met Raj at an orphanage in Delhi. He'd been sitting alone, reading a book in English that was far too advanced for his age level, his lips moving silently as he sounded out words. Sarah had asked him what he was reading, and he'd looked up with those serious eyes and said, "I'm learning. My mother said education would give me everything she couldn't." Sarah and David had looked at each other, and something passed between them: recognition, certainty, the feeling that some meetings are orchestrated by forces larger than coincidence. The adoption process took 18 months. But finally, Raj came home to a house in Oregon with his own bedroom and more food than he knew what to do with, and parents who wanted to know about his mother, who encouraged him to talk about her, who understood that loving them didn't mean forgetting her. The invitation to Family Feud had come through a non-profit organization that helped adopted children from around the world celebrate their heritage while building new lives. Raj had been hesitant at first. He didn't like attention, didn't like crowds, but Sarah had gently encouraged him. "Your mother wanted you to have experiences," she'd said. "She wanted you to have a big life. Maybe this is part of that." And so here he was, standing under lights that felt like the sun of Mumbai and America combined, wearing his mother's necklace and trying to be brave enough to answer game show questions, when all he really wanted was to tell the world about the woman who'd given him everything, including this small piece of silver that meant more than all the prizes Steve Harvey could offer. Steve Harvey stood very still, his hand still pointing toward the necklace, his question hanging in the air like something tangible. "It's my mother's," Raj had said, and the present tense hadn't escaped Steve's notice. Years of interviewing people, of listening to the spaces between words, of understanding that grammar reveals truth, All of it converged in this moment of recognition. "Your mother's?" Steve repeated softly, and there was a question embedded in the statement. A gentle invitation for Raj to explain if he wanted to share if he felt safe enough. Raj nodded, his hand still wrapped around the pendant. The studio lights caught the silver, making it flash like a small star against his chest. His throat worked as he swallowed, and you could see him making a decision to speak or stay silent, to protect his grief or risk sharing it with 300 strangers and millions of viewers who would eventually watch this moment unfold. "She gave it to me before she died," Raj said, and his voice was so quiet the sound engineers had to boost the levels. "In the hospital. She said it was my grandmother's first, then hers, and now it's mine. She said, 'When I wear it, I carry 3 generations of love.'" The audience made a collective sound, not quite a gasp, not quite a sigh, but something in between. A recognition of loss so profound that even strangers could feel its weight pressing against their chests. Several people in the front rows had their hands over their mouths. A woman in the third row was already crying, tears streaming silently down her face. Steve's eyes had filled with tears, but he was still standing, still holding himself together through sheer professional will. His microphone hung loose in his hand, momentarily forgotten. The cameras had all zoomed in now, capturing every nuance of this exchange. The boy clutching his necklace, the host fighting his emotions, the studio transforming from a place of entertainment into something that felt more like a confession booth, a sanctuary, a space where truth could be spoken without judgment. "How old were you?" Steve asked, his voice gentle but thick with emotion. 10, Raj answered. "She had pneumonia. We couldn't afford the good hospital, so we went to the charity one. The doctors tried, but it was too late. She'd been sick for a long time but kept working because if she stopped, we wouldn't eat." The silence that followed was absolute. You could hear the hum of the electrical systems, the whisper of the ventilation, the breathing of 300 people who'd forgotten they were supposed to be watching entertainment. This wasn't entertainment anymore. This was testimony. This was a child speaking his mother's name and his mother's sacrifice into existence, refusing to let her be forgotten. Steve set his cards down on the podium with trembling hands. The game, the questions, the points, none of it mattered. He walked around to the contestant's side, moving slowly, deliberately, as if approaching something sacred that required reverence. "What was her name?" Steve asked. "Anjali," Raj said, and saying her name seemed to unlock something in his chest. "Anjali Sharma. She worked 3 jobs. She cleaned houses and sold flowers and sewed clothes. She made my school uniform by hand because we couldn't buy one. She taught herself to read better so she could help me with homework. She gave me food even when there wasn't enough for both of us. I didn't know that then, but I understand it now." Steve had reached Raj now, standing beside him at the podium, and the size difference was stark. This giant of American entertainment, and this small boy from Mumbai, who'd survived more loss in 12 years than most people experience in a lifetime. But somehow, in this moment, they were equals. 2 humans, sharing the universal language of grief, of love, of remembering people who'd shaped them, and then left them to carry that shape forward alone. "She sounds like she was an incredible woman," Steve said, and his voice had dropped to that particular register that happens when you're trying not to cry and failing. "She was everything," Raj said simply. "She was my whole world, and then she was gone, and the world got so big and scary and empty." The camera operators were crying now, trying to keep their shots steady while tears blurred their vision. The director in the control room had his head in his hands, having long since given up any pretense of managing the show's pace or structure. This was bigger than production schedules. This was the kind of moment that reminded everyone why they'd gotten into television in the first place, not for the ratings or the revenue, but for those rare instances when the medium becomes a vessel for something true and necessary and healing. Sarah and David Mitchell were in the audience, holding each other, watching their son speak his truth on national television. Sarah had her hand pressed against her heart, and David's arm was around her shoulders so tight his knuckles had gone white. They were crying too, but their tears were complicated grief for the mother their son had lost, gratitude that he was finally able to speak about her, pride that he'd found the courage to be vulnerable in such a public space. Steve reached out slowly, telegraphing his movements so Raj could refuse if he wanted to, and placed his hand on the boy's shoulder. "Can I ask you something?" Raj nodded. "Do you talk to her when you touch the necklace?" Raj's eyes widened slightly, surprised that Steve had understood this without being told. He nodded again, more vigorously this time. "Every day," Raj whispered. "I tell her about school and my new parents and America and everything she didn't get to see. I tell her I'm trying to make her proud. I tell her I miss her so much it feels like I can't breathe sometimes." Steve's composure finally cracked. His face crumpled, and tears spilled down his cheeks, not delicate, camera-friendly tears, but real sobs that shook his shoulders and made his whole body tremble. He pulled Raj into an embrace, and the boy went willingly, clinging to this stranger who somehow understood, who'd created space for his grief to be witnessed and honored. The audience was standing now, though no one had asked them to stand. It happened organically, people rising to their feet as if pulled by invisible strings, as if their bodies understood before their minds did that they were witnessing something sacred. The applause started softly, almost hesitantly, as if people weren't sure whether it was appropriate to applaud grief. But it built not the performative applause of entertainment, but the solemn, steady applause of bearing witness, of saying, "We see you, we honor you, we will remember with you." Steve pulled back from the embrace but kept his hands on Raj's shoulders, and when he spoke, his voice carried to every corner of that studio and beyond, to everyone who would eventually watch this moment and feel their own losses rising to the surface. "Your mama is so proud of you," Steve said with absolute certainty. "I don't know how I know that, but I know it in my bones. She's watching you right now, and she's seeing her boy standing here brave and strong and honest, telling the truth about how much you loved her, how much you still love her. That's her legacy, son. Not the necklace, though that's precious. Her real legacy is you, the boy she raised, to be kind and brave and real." Raj was crying openly now, the tears he'd been holding back finally released in the safety of being truly seen. His hand was still on the necklace, but his grip had loosened slightly, as if he'd finally understood that his mother's love wasn't contained in the silver it lived in him, in every choice he made. In every moment, he chose courage over comfort. Steve turned to face the cameras, his arm still around Raj's shoulders, and spoke directly to the millions who would watch this. "This young man just taught us something that I think we forget, in our rush to be entertained, to be distracted, to avoid pain," Steve said. "He taught us that grief is love that has nowhere to go. That carrying our losses doesn't make us weak, it makes us human. That the people who leave us never really leave as long as we have the courage to speak their names, to honor their sacrifices, to live the lives they made possible through their love." He looked down at Raj, and in his eyes was something like wonder, like recognition, like the dawning understanding that this child had just cracked open something essential about what it means to be alive and loving and mortal. "Anjali Sharma," Steve said, speaking her name to the studio, to America, to the universe. "We honor you today. We see what you gave. We witness what you built. Your son stands here wearing your love around his neck, carrying your dreams in his heart, and he's going to do amazing things because you taught him what amazing looks like. It looks like a mother working 3 jobs. It looks like going without so your child can have. It looks like love that survives death and distance, and every circumstance that tries to diminish it." The applause had become something else now, sustained, powerful, a collective affirmation that rippled through the studio like a wave. People weren't just clapping for Raj or for Anjali's memory. They were clapping for every mother who'd sacrificed, every child who'd survived loss, every person who'd ever loved someone enough to carry them forward even after they were gone. Steve wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, then turned to the director. "We're taking a break," he said, and it wasn't a request. "We need a minute here. This young man and I need to talk, and we're not doing it on anybody's schedule but ours." The cameras kept rolling because no one had the heart to turn them off, but the commercial break happened anyway, a strange suspension of the rules that usually govern television production. Because some moments are bigger than advertising revenue, bigger than scheduled programming, bigger than any machinery of entertainment. And in that space between what was planned and what was needed, Steve Harvey sat down with Raj on the edge of the stage, their feet dangling, and asked him to tell more stories about Anjali. about the flower selling and the hand-sewn uniforms and the dreams she'd planted in her son's heart like seeds that would outlive her. When the cameras came back, though, they'd never really left. Just witnessed from a more respectful distance, Steve Harvey and Raj were still sitting on the edge of the stage, but something had shifted in the space between them. The grief was still there, would always be there, but it had been joined by something else. Understanding, maybe, or permission, or simply the recognition that pain shared becomes slightly more bearable, that speaking names and memories into the light makes them real in ways that silence never can. Steve had been listening for the better part of 10 minutes, asking quiet questions and receiving answers that painted a portrait of a woman he'd never met but felt he knew intimately. Anjali, who sang while she worked. Anjali, who saved for months to buy Raj a birthday cake. Anjali, who read to him every night from library books, even when she was exhausted beyond measure. Anjali, who told him that education was the one thing poverty couldn't steal if you guarded it carefully enough. The studio had remained standing during this entire exchange, as if sitting down would somehow dishonor what was happening. The silence was profound, broken only by Raj's soft voice and the occasional rustle of tissues being pulled from purses, the quiet sniffles of strangers who'd been given permission by this child's courage to feel their own losses, to remember their own people who'd sacrificed everything. Steve finally stood, offering his hand to help Raj to his feet. The boy took it, and Steve noticed how small his hand was, how light, how it seemed impossible that someone so small could carry so much weight. He looked out into the audience, found Sarah and David Mitchell still standing in the third row, their faces wet with tears, but also something else, gratitude, maybe, that their son had found a space safe enough to speak his deepest truth. "Would you folks come up here?" Steve called to them, gesturing them forward. Sarah and David looked at each other, uncertain, then made their way down the aisle and onto the stage. They moved to Raj's side immediately, Sarah's hand finding his shoulder, David standing just behind them both, creating a shelter with their bodies. Steve looked at them, this couple, who'd chosen to love a child who came with grief and loss and memories of a mother who couldn't be replaced, and something in his face softened even further. "I want to know something," Steve said to them, his voice still rough from crying but steady now. "How do you honor her?" "Anjali. How do you make sure Raj knows he doesn't have to choose between loving you and remembering her?" Sarah's eyes filled with fresh tears, but she smiled through them. "We talk about her every day," she said, her voice carrying clearly in the hushed studio. "We have pictures of her in Raj's room. On his birthday, we light a candle for her. We cook Indian food and try to learn about the culture she came from. We tell him constantly that she's the reason he's so amazing, that everything good in him started with her love." David nodded, adding quietly, "We're not trying to replace her. We couldn't even if we wanted to. We're just trying to add to what she started, to build on the foundation she laid with her life." Steve's face crumpled again, and he had to take a moment before he could speak. When he did, his words carried the weight of conviction, of truth spoken from deep wells of understanding. "You're doing what love is supposed to do," he said to Sarah and David. "Real love doesn't erase what came before. It doesn't demand that you forget or move on or pretend the past didn't happen. Real love makes space for all of it, the grief and the joy, the memory and the present, the mother who gave everything and the parents who chose to keep giving." He turned back to Raj, kneeling down to his eye level the way he'd done with Emma, the way he seemed to instinctively know that some conversations require eye contact, require the surrender of height and authority in favor of equality and presence. "I want to tell you something about that necklace," Steve said, his voice gentle but firm. "Your mama was right when she said it carries 3 generations of love, but I think it carries something else too. It carries a promise." Raj tilted his head slightly, listening with the intensity of someone who'd learned that words matter, that what people say can change everything. "Every time you touch it," Steve continued, "you're keeping a promise to her, the promise that you'll live, not just survive, but really live the way she wanted you to live, when she worked herself to exhaustion, when she gave you her food, when she stayed up late sewing your uniform. She didn't do all that so you could spend your life in grief. She did it so you could have joy, education, opportunity, love. So every time you succeed, every time you're kind, Every time you choose courage, that's you keeping your promise to her." Raj's hand had drifted to the necklace again, but this time his touch was different. Not desperate or clinging, but gentle, almost reverent, as if he was greeting an old friend rather than holding on for dear life. "But here's what I want you to understand," Steve said, and he reached out to place his hand over Raj's, over the necklace, creating a connection between them. "You're also allowed to take it off sometimes. You're allowed to have days where the weight of remembering feels too heavy. You're allowed to be 12 years old, to play and laugh and be silly and forget about loss for a little while. Your mama wouldn't want this necklace to be a chain that keeps you locked in grief. She'd want it to be a reminder that you're loved past, present, and future." The wisdom in this landed visibly. You could see it in the way Raj's shoulders relaxed slightly, in the way something eased in his face. Permission. That's what Steve had given him. Permission to grieve and permission to heal, permission to remember and permission to live, permission to honor his mother by becoming the fullest version of himself rather than a monument to loss. Sarah had her arm around Raj now, and David's hand was on his other shoulder, and Steve stood before them all, and for a moment, the four of them created a tableau that felt almost holy. A child held by the past and the present simultaneously, supported by the memory of sacrifice and the reality of chosen love, standing at the intersection of grief and hope. Steve addressed the audience then, his voice carrying to every corner of the studio and beyond. "Sometimes we think the only way to honor the people we've lost is to stay sad forever," he said. "To carry our grief like a badge that proves we really love them. But I don't think that's what they'd want. I think they'd want us to take all that love they poured into us and let it overflow into the world, to become the people they dreamed we could be, to live lives so full and beautiful that their sacrifice wasn't just worth it. It multiplied, it compounded, it created ripples that spread far beyond what they could have imagined." He looked down at Raj one more time. "Your mama gave you life twice," he said softly. "Once when you were born, and again when she gave you that necklace and told you to remember. But now you get to give her something back. You get to live the life she died believing you'd have. And every good thing you do, every person you help, every dream you chase that's her legacy continuing, that's her love still working in the world." The studio was absolutely silent, but it wasn't an empty silence. It was full pregnant with understanding, with recognition, with the collective realization that they'd all just witnessed something that would change them, that would ripple outward in ways they couldn't yet measure. Steve stood and extended his arms, and Raj stepped into them again, but this time the embrace felt different, not desperate or overwhelmed, but peaceful, healing, the kind of hug that says, "I see you, I honor you, you're going to be okay." When they finally pulled apart, Steve kept his hands on Raj's shoulders and smiled. Really smiled. The first genuine smile since this conversation began. "You know what we're going to do?" Steve said. "We're going to finish this game. We're going to play, and laugh, and try to win some money for charity, because that's what your mama would want. She'd want you to have fun, to be a kid, to experience joy. And then, after the show, we're going to make sure you and your family have resources, counseling, support, whatever you need to keep healing, to keep growing, to keep becoming." He looked at Sarah and David. "And we're going to honor Anjali Sharma. We're going to make sure her name and her story live on, so that other mothers working 3 jobs, other children surviving loss, other families built through choice rather than biology, they'll all know they're not alone." The audience erupted, then not in applause this time, but in something that sounded almost like a cheer, like a collective affirmation of life and love, and the stubborn persistence of hope in the face of loss. People were hugging strangers beside them, reaching across aisles to hold hands, creating a web of connection and solidarity that had nothing to do with entertainment and everything to do with being human together. And in the center of it all stood a 12-year-old boy wearing his mother's necklace, held by parents who'd chosen him, witnessed by a television host, who'd remembered that his real job wasn't to make people laugh, but to help them feel, to create space for truth, to remind everyone watching that we're all connected by invisible threads of love and loss, and the courage it takes to keep going anyway. The episode aired on a Saturday evening in June. The network had debated whether to include the full exchange 15 minutes of television with no jokes, no gameplay, just a child and a host talking about loss and love and a silver necklace that carried the weight of generations. But they aired it intact, understanding that some moments lose their power when you try to edit them into something more palatable. Within 24 hours, the clip had been viewed 60 million times. But the numbers, as always, tell only part of the story. They don't capture the mother in Kenya, who watched it on her phone while her children slept and finally allowed herself to cry for the sacrifices she'd been making in silence, believing no one noticed. They don't measure the adoptive father in Australia, who called his son, now grown, now a father himself, and said for the first time, "I want you to tell me about your birth mother. I want to know her name. I want to honor what she gave you." They don't quantify the orphans around the world who watched Raj speak his mother's name and felt for the first time that their own losses mattered, that their own memories deserved to be spoken aloud. The letters came by the tens of thousands. To the network, to Steve Harvey, to the Mitchells' home in Oregon, where Sarah had to set up a separate email address just to handle the volume. People wrote to share their own stories of mothers who'd worked impossible hours, of children who wore keepsakes like armor, of families built through choice and love rather than biology. But more than sharing, they wrote to say, thank you for showing that grief doesn't have a timeline, that love survives death, that speaking the names of the people we've lost is an act of resurrection. Raj returned to his school in Portland, but he was different now. Not healed grief that profound doesn't heal so much as it transforms, but lighter. He'd spoken his mother's name on television, and the world hadn't collapsed. Instead, it had held him. Teachers and classmates who'd never quite known how to talk to him about his loss now had permission to ask about Anjali, to say her name, to acknowledge that she'd existed and mattered. He started a project for his 8th grade English class, collecting stories from other adopted children about the families they'd come from, the people they remembered, the losses they carried. It became a book, self-published, modest, but profound, titled 3 Generations of Love, Stories of Mothers We Carry. The introduction was simple. This is for everyone who wears their mother's necklace, their father's watch, their grandmother's ring. You are not alone in your remembering. Steve Harvey didn't forget. He established the Anjali Sharma Memorial Scholarship for children who'd lost parents but were determined to pursue education despite their grief. He visited the Mitchells twice in that first year, not with cameras or publicity, just quiet dinners where he listened to Raj talk about school and soccer, and the small, ordinary miracles of a life being rebuilt. On the first anniversary of Anjali's death, Steve flew to Mumbai and visited the charity hospital where she died, donating funds to improve their pneumonia treatment protocols so that other mothers might survive what Anjali hadn't. The necklace itself became a symbol. Jewelers began creating similar pieces, donating proceeds to organizations supporting orphans and single mothers. But Raj's remained unique not because of its design, but because of what it carried. The warmth of his grandmother's hands, the sacrifice of his mother's love, the promise of a life lived fully in honor of both. Sarah and David officially adopted 2 more children in the years that followed, siblings from Vietnam who'd lost their parents in a flood. Raj helped them settle in, taught them that grief and joy could coexist, that new love didn't erase old love, but added to it, built on it, honored it. The house in Oregon filled with photographs and stories, and the particular richness that comes from families who understand that love is a choice you make every day, not a condition of biology. And somewhere, in a studio that had witnessed something sacred, the footage remained a permanent record of the moment a child taught a nation that the people we lose never really leave us. They live in the jewelry we wear, the promises we keep, the courage we find to speak their names aloud. They live in the lives we build on foundations they laid with their sacrifice. They live in the love that refuses to end even when hearts stop beating. Because television doesn't just entertain. Sometimes, in those rare and precious moments when a boy clutches his mother's necklace and a host remembers to listen with his whole heart, it does something far more important. It witnesses, it validates. It reminds us that we're all carrying someone, that we're all honoring someone, that we're all trying to live lives worthy of the love that was poured into us. And somewhere out there, in every home where someone wears a keepsake from someone they've lost, Anjali Sharma's story lives on a reminder that 3 generations of love is never really gone, just transformed, just waiting for someone brave enough to speak it into the light.